A Columbia Records executive threatened to drop Johnny Cash if he didn't change his sound. Johnny's response was so brutal, it became Nashville legend and saved country music forever. March 15th, 1968. Columbia Records offices, Nashville, Tennessee. Johnny Cash was sitting across from the most powerful man in country music, a man who could make or break careers with a single phone call. The executive had summoned Johnny to this meeting with one purpose: to put the man in black back in line. What happened in the next 30 minutes would either destroy Johnny's career or revolutionize the entire music industry. Johnny Cash was about to prove that some artists couldn't be bought, bullied, or broken. To understand the magnitude of what happened that day, you need to understand where Johnny Cash was in 1968. And you need to understand how the record industry worked back then. It wasn't like today where artists have some control over their music. In 1968, record companies owned everything: the songs, the sound, the image, even the soul of their performers. Johnny Cash had been with Columbia Records since 1958. 10 years of hit records, sold-out concerts, and steadily growing fame. But by 1968, Johnny was becoming a problem for the suits in New York. He wasn't playing by their rules anymore. His music was getting darker, more political, more real. And that scared the hell out of them. The man sitting across from Johnny that day was Clive Davis, the head of Columbia Records. But the real power behind this confrontation was a senior vice president named Harold Morrison. Morrison was everything wrong with the music industry wrapped up in a $500 suit and a fake smile. He'd made his career by taking authentic artists and turning them into profitable products. He'd done it to dozens of country singers, folk artists, even some rock and roll acts. He'd take their rough edges, sand them down, and package them for mass consumption. Morrison had been watching Johnny Cash for months, and he didn't like what he saw. Johnny was supposed to be Columbia's reliable country cash cow, cranking out simple songs about trains and love and heartbreak. Instead, Johnny was recording songs about Vietnam War protesters, prison reform, and Native American rights. He was performing in federal prisons. He was associating with folk singers and protest musicians. Worst of all, he was thinking for himself. The trouble had started earlier that year, when Johnny recorded an album called The Holy Land. It was Johnny's deeply personal exploration of his Christian faith, recorded in Israel with biblical themes and spiritual content. The album was authentic, heartfelt, and completely uncommercial. It bombed spectacularly, selling fewer copies than any Johnny Cash album in years. Morrison saw this as proof that Johnny needed to be reined in. In his mind, Johnny Cash was getting too big for his britches, too convinced of his own artistic importance. Morrison believed that artists were employees, nothing more. They were supposed to show up, sing what they were told to sing, and collect their paychecks. This idea of artistic integrity was just expensive nonsense that hurt the bottom line. So Morrison had arranged this meeting, ostensibly to discuss Johnny's next album, but really to lay down the law. He'd done the same thing to other artists who'd gotten too independent. Usually it worked. A few threats about contract cancellation, some reminders about who really controlled their careers, and the artists fell back in line. Harold Morrison had no idea who he was dealing with. Johnny arrived at the Columbia offices that Friday afternoon around 2 p.m. He was dressed in his signature black, but this wasn't the theatrical black of his stage performances. This was business black, serious black, the kind of black that meant Johnny Cash wasn't here to play games. Morrison's secretary, a nervous young woman named Patricia, showed Johnny into the conference room where Morrison was waiting. Also present were Morrison's assistant, a lawyer from Columbia's legal department, and Clive Davis himself, though Davis would later claim he was just there as an observer. Morrison was a big man, probably 250 pounds, with the soft look of someone who'd spent too many years behind a desk eating expensive lunches. He had the kind of confidence that came from wielding power over people who needed him more than he needed them. But as Johnny walked into that room, Morrison noticed something that should have warned him off. Johnny Cash didn't look like a man who needed anything from anybody. "Johnny," Morrison said, standing up and extending his hand. "Good to see you, man. Have a seat. Let's talk." Johnny shook Morrison's hand but didn't sit down immediately. He looked around the room, taking in the gold records on the walls, the expensive furniture, the intimidating setup, designed to make artists feel small and grateful. "Nice office, Harold," Johnny said, his voice carrying that distinctive rumble that could make hello sound like a threat. "Must be nice making all this money off other people's music." Morrison's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Hey, we're all in this together, right? Your success is our success." Johnny finally sat down, but not in the chair Morrison had indicated. Instead, he moved to a different chair, one that put his back to the wall and gave him a clear view of everyone in the room. It was a small thing, but everyone noticed it. Johnny Cash wasn't going to be positioned where they wanted him. "So," Morrison said, settling back into his chair, "let's talk about your future. Your next album. What about it?" Morrison opened a folder on the table. "Well, we've been looking at the numbers, Johnny, and we need to have a frank discussion about direction." "Direction?" Johnny repeated, his voice flat. "Yes. Look, the Holy Land it was interesting, artistic. But Johnny, it didn't sell. And at the end of the day, we're in business to sell records." Johnny didn't respond. He just stared at Morrison with those dark eyes, waiting. Morrison continued, his confidence building as he launched into what was clearly a prepared speech. "What we need from you, Johnny, is to get back to what you do best. Country music, simple songs about real American values. Love, family, hard work, patriotism, the kind of songs that made you famous in the first place." "Songs like what?" Morrison pulled out a list. "Well, we've got some writers who've prepared material specifically for you. There's a great song called My Country, Right or Wrong. Very patriotic, very timely with everything going on in Vietnam. There's another one called Saturday Night in Small Town, USA. Real heartland stuff. And there's a beautiful ballad called She'll Wait for Me Forever that could be a huge hit on both country and pop radio." Johnny looked at the list without touching it. "And if I don't want to record these songs?" Morrison's mask slipped just a little. "Well, Johnny, you're under contract. We have the right to approve your material." "The right," Johnny said. "That's correct. And frankly, we think you've been getting some bad advice lately. This protest music, these prison concerts, this folk music influence, it's not good for your image. It's not good for sales. It's not good for Columbia Records." Johnny leaned back in his chair. "So, what you're telling me is that I should stop singing about things that matter and start singing about Saturday nights and blind patriotism." Morrison sensed he was losing control of the conversation. "I'm telling you that you need to remember who you work for. We made you, Johnny. We can unmake you just as easily." The room went completely silent. Clive Davis shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The lawyer looked down at his notes. Morrison's assistant stared at his hands. Johnny Cash stood up slowly. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Harold, you seem to be confused about something. So, let me clear it up for you." Morrison tried to maintain his executive composure, but something in Johnny's tone made him nervous. "I don't work for you," Johnny continued. "I work for the people who buy my records, the people who come to my concerts, the people who find something real in my music when everything else in their lives feels fake. Johnny, you're under contract. I'm under contract to make records, not to be your puppet." Morrison's face was getting red. "Listen, Cash, you can take that artistic integrity nonsense and shove it. This is business. You sing what we tell you to sing, or you don't sing at all." That was the moment Harold Morrison made the biggest mistake of his career. Johnny Cash smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that prisoners at Folsom had learned to fear. "Harold," Johnny said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "you just made two mistakes. First, you forgot that I was making hit records before you ever heard of me. Second, you seem to think that threatening me is going to work." Johnny walked around the table until he was standing directly behind Morrison's chair. Morrison had to turn around to look at him, putting himself in the psychologically disadvantaged position of looking up. "Let me tell you something about contracts," Johnny said. "A contract is just paper, and paper burns." Morrison tried to stand up, but Johnny put a hand on his shoulder and gently but firmly kept him in his seat. "I've been thinking about this for months," Johnny continued. thinking about what Columbia Records really wants from me. And I finally figured it out. You don't want Johnny Cash. You want a Johnny Cash impersonator. Someone who looks like me and sounds like me, but says only what you want him to say. Johnny walked back to his chair and sat down. Well, Harold, I've got bad news for you. I'm the real Johnny Cash. And the real Johnny Cash doesn't take orders from anyone. Morrison was sweating now. Johnny, you're making a big mistake. We can destroy you. We can make sure you never record again. Johnny laughed. Actually laughed. Harold, do you know what I was doing before I made records? I don't. I was working construction. I was selling appliances door to door. I was doing whatever it took to feed my family. You think I'm afraid of going back to that? Johnny leaned forward, his eyes locked on Morrison's. But here's what you should be afraid of. I'm going to walk out of this office, and I'm going to make the best record of my career. I'm going to sing about whatever I damn well please. I'm going to record songs about prison reform and Vietnam and the way this country treats its poor people. And when that record comes out and it becomes a huge hit, everyone in Nashville is going to know that Johnny Cash doesn't need Harold Morrison. Morrison tried one last time. You can't do that. We won't release it. Johnny stood up again. Then I guess we have a problem. Because I'm not recording anything else. The silence in the room was deafening. Clive Davis was staring at Johnny with something that looked like admiration. The lawyer was furiously taking notes. Morrison looked like a man who had just realized he was in a poker game with someone holding all the cards. Johnny moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back. Oh, and Harold? That threat about destroying my career? You might want to think about that more carefully. What do you mean? Johnny's smile was cold as winter. I mean that I know every major artist on this label, and they all have the same complaints about you that I do. They're all tired of being treated like employees instead of artists. Now, if something unfortunate were to happen to my career, I might have to start talking to some of those artists, sharing stories, comparing notes. Morrison's face went pale. The last thing Columbia Records needed was a revolt by their major artists. And one more thing, Johnny said, his hand on the door handle. If you ever, and I mean ever, threaten me again, I will personally make sure that every music journalist in America knows exactly how Columbia Records treats its artists. I'll tell them about this meeting. I'll tell them about your Saturday night in small-town USA and your threats about destroying careers. Do you understand me? Morrison nodded weakly. Good. Now I'm going to go make a record, a real record, and you're going to release it and promote it and pretend like you believe in it. Because if you don't, I'm going to take this story public, and Columbia Records is going to look like the kind of company that tries to silence its artists for having opinions. Johnny opened the door, then paused one more time. Oh, and Harold? Next time you want to have a meeting with me, you can come to my studio. I don't like your office. Johnny Cash walked out, leaving Harold Morrison sitting in stunned silence, Clive Davis trying not to laugh. In a room full of executives who had just witnessed the most complete dismantling of a record company power play in music history. The aftermath of that meeting changed everything. Within a week, word of Johnny's confrontation with Morrison had spread through Nashville like wildfire. Artists who had been quietly frustrated with their own record companies suddenly felt emboldened. Folk singers, country artists, even some rock musicians began demanding more control over their music. Harold Morrison tried to save face by claiming that the meeting had been productive and that Johnny Cash remained a valued member of the Columbia family. But everyone in the industry knew what had really happened. Morrison's authority had been publicly challenged and found wanting. Johnny, meanwhile, went directly to his studio and began work on what would become At Folsom Prison, one of the most important albums in music history. He recorded songs about prisoners, outcasts, and forgotten people. He sang with raw emotion and uncompromising honesty. And Columbia Records, despite their earlier threats, released every note of it. The album was a massive success, both critically and commercially. It proved that audiences were hungry for authentic music, not the sanitized corporate product that Morrison had been pushing. At Folsom Prison reached #1 on the country charts and crossed over to mainstream success, in a way that Johnny's previous safe records never had. But the real impact of Johnny's confrontation with Morrison went far beyond one album. It established a precedent that artists could fight back against corporate control. It showed that authenticity and artistic integrity weren't just noble ideals, they were good business. Harold Morrison never recovered from the humiliation. He was quietly reassigned to a lesser position within Columbia Records and eventually left the music industry entirely. Clive Davis, who had witnessed Johnny's performance that day, became one of Johnny's strongest supporters and advocates within the company. Years later, when Johnny was asked about that meeting, he downplayed his role. "I just told them the truth," he would say. "Artists aren't employees. We're partners, and partners deserve respect." But those who were there that day knew they had witnessed something historic. They had seen the moment when one man's refusal to compromise changed the entire music industry. Johnny Cash didn't just stand up to Harold Morrison that day, he stood up for every artist who had ever been told to water down their message, every musician who had been pressured to choose commercial success over personal truth, every creative person who had been made to feel like a product instead of a human being. The confrontation lasted less than 30 minutes, but its effects are still being felt today. Every time an artist refuses to be silenced, every time a musician demands creative control, every time someone chooses authenticity over easy money. Johnny Cash proved that day that the most powerful force in the music industry isn't money or contracts or corporate pressure. It's the truth. And when the truth is delivered by someone who absolutely refuses to back down, it can change everything. Harold Morrison thought he could control Johnny Cash like he had controlled so many other artists. He was wrong, dead wrong. And what Johnny did to him that day didn't just become industry legend. It became a lesson that every record executive learned, whether they wanted to or not. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not on stages or in studios, but in corporate conference rooms where the future of music is decided. And sometimes those battles are won by one man who simply refuses to be anything other than exactly who he is. Johnny Cash walked into that meeting as a successful country singer. He walked out as a revolutionary,